welcome to your Thursday Daily Delivery. I am Michael Rand, and sorry, folks, I'm afraid I don't have a ton of great news to share with you today in the beginning of this first segment that I like to call What Did I Miss? Later on, we'll have some happier news. We'll have a nice interview with Marcus Fuller from the Star Tribune. We'll talk a lot of Gopher hoops in that interview. But at the outset, not a ton of great news. Let's start with the Wild. Minnesota Wild shut down 5 players in COVID protocol, joining Marcus Foligno, so that makes 6. And season shut down until next Tuesday. That's 5. They're going to miss 4 games. They were supposed to play in Colorado tonight. They were supposed to have a home set this weekend against Arizona, and then they were supposed to play St. Louis. None of those games happening. So next game, I believe, will be next Thursday if they're able to get things going again. So, just joining a lot of teams. This is not uncommon in the NHL. It's not uncommon in sports, especially early in seasons before leagues kind of figure out how to navigate these protocols. Nick Bukestad, Nick Bonino, Joel Eriksson, Marcus Johansson, Jared Spurgeon, all going on the COVID list. It doesn't necessarily mean they all have COVID. Could just mean that some of them were in close contact with someone who tested positive. But, troubling thing for the Wild. They're 6-5 right now, a decent start to the season, and now they will be delayed for 4 games at a minimum. Same story, essentially, but on the women's side of hockey. National Women's Hockey League had to shut down as well. They were so close to the finish line of their very abbreviated season with the Whitecaps, the Minnesota Whitecaps, in the mix for a championship. They were supposed to play the semifinals today, the finals tomorrow. They are shut down because the COVID numbers do not look great there either. So another tough break for a Minnesota team. But again, this is life in the COVID era, right? This is, if you're trying to play through, if you're not, even if you're in a bubble, which the Women's Hockey League was in, there's no 100% guarantee that you're going to be able to escape this until the numbers are completely down, until the vaccine is completely kicked in. This is going to be the story in sports, unfortunately. I thought I might at least be able to tell you about a Wolves victory. It sure looked that way when they led the Spurs 97-81 in the fourth quarter. Yeah, that's a 16-point fourth quarter lead. At that point, ESPN stats gave them a 97.8% chance to win. ESPN stats is a computer rhythm algorithm, not a sentient being who has watched Timberwolves games this season. I would bet Wolves fans gave them about a 50% chance to win when they had a 16-point fourth quarter lead, and they were correct. Wolves lose 111-108. They have a long stretch of stagnant offense. They have a stretch of poor defense. Everything kind of goes wrong down the stretch again. D'Angelo Russell takes 7 shots in the fourth quarter, only makes 2 of them. Malik Beasley, who had been the hot hand for most of the game, takes only 4 shots in the fourth quarter, makes 2 of them. Here is D'Angelo Russell on kind of his philosophy in the fourth quarter and, maybe why he decided he was the one to take those shots down the stretch.
I feel like throughout the game, I'm kind of being less aggressive, trying to get guys involved and get guys confidence and a rhythm going for them. Towards the end of the game, I try to be more aggressive. So win or lose, I'll take that on. I'll take that fault, win or lose, with me being aggressive at the end of the game.
Yeah, and I get what D'Lo's saying there. You want your best players taking those shots. The end of games are different sometimes than, the first 45, 44 minutes of a game. Defenses clamp down. Sometimes it does take a little bit of hero ball. Maybe not quite as much hero ball as D'Angelo Russell played in Wednesday night's game. Read more, as always, about all these stories on StarTribune.com and in your Star Tribune newspaper.
I'm Nyla Jean Myers, Senior Assistant Sports Editor at the Star Tribune. Thank you for listening to Strip Sports Daily Delivery. This work is made possible by our Star Tribune subscribers. For unlimited access to the articles mentioned in this podcast and our coverage of Minnesota sports from pros to preps, go to StarTribune.com/subscribe.
All right, I'm very happy to be joined right now by Marcus Fuller. Marcus covers college basketball, Gophers basketball for the Star Tribune. Does a great job of it. Follow his work on StarTribune.com. Follow him on Twitter. Marcus, how are you doing today?
Not bad, not bad. Appreciate it. I'm glad that we finally got the Gophers on our podcast here.
I am
excited.
too. I'm thrilled, and I want to talk. It's a good time to talk Gophers. They play at Rutgers Thursday night. Marcus, you know better than anybody, but I can't help but point this out. They have not won a road game this season. I don't imagine there has been a lot of teams to make the NCAA tournament that haven't won a road game all season, and yet they do find themselves still in most of these bracket projections. Tell me a little bit more about kind of what where you see the road struggles and kind of that piece of their season so far.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up the NCAA tournament, and I think that it's obvious that, the players are not really thinking about that right now. All the fans and obviously the media like ourselves, it seems like every game that they lose or every game that they win, we bring up where they are in the bracket. And, so far this season, they have not dropped out of the bracket, but they did drop out of the top 25 this week for the first time in 5 weeks. They were as high as 16th, and now, obviously they're not ranked. And a large part of that is because they have not won on the road. At Purdue, they lost by 19. It was their fifth road loss this year. They're 0-5. And it's not about them necessarily losing these games. Their first 4 road games were against ranked opponents. It's how they're losing them. And I think their average margin of defeat this year is by 19 points. And that includes the home loss to Maryland by 14, which was their first home loss of the season. So, in the beginning, it was about them not translating how they play at home or transferring that, how they play at home to the road. And then now, because of that home loss to Maryland, it seems like if they keep losing these games by big margins on the road, that could carry over to them struggling at home as well.
It does seem like their schedule maybe does, I don't say get easier because the Big Ten is going to be a challenge no matter what, but they had a pretty tough run of games at the first half of the Big Ten season, correct?
They had 7 games in a row versus ranked opponents and 8 straight Big Ten ranked opponents, which if you look back, the Gophers did some digging for us. And I think St. John's in 2011, 2012 was the last high major team that had a stretch like that of 8 straight ranked opponents in conference play. This year, because there are so many good Big Ten teams, the Gophers are not the only one that have had a stretch of ranked opponents. Northwestern, they have 8 straight losses right now, and those first 6 losses they had versus ranked opponents. So I think, people were encouraged because it was a tough stretch, but they did win some of those games. They beat Iowa, they beat Michigan, they beat Ohio State, and that's what's keeping them in the NCAA tournament right now. But those wins were at home. Now they have the back half of their schedule is road heavy, and they're not playing any ranked opponents on the road. So each one of these games that they lose on the road, starting with Rutgers on Thursday, if they lose, it'll drop them quite a bit out of the NCAA tournament mix.
And it seems strange to me that this would be a particular issue this year, right? It seems like this year of all years should be easier to play on the road because there's not fans, right? Is that so? Have they figured out what it is in particular this year that's causing this this discrepancy or them not being able to bring their game on the road with them?
I think that, you make a good point that, is there a true home court advantage this year in college basketball? Obviously not with the environments, the energy from the fans. They just played at Purdue, right? And they lost by 19. And if this was a normal season, you'd say, hey, that's not that, out of the question because Purdue has one of the craziest environments in all of college basketball at Mackey Arena. It's one of my favorite fan bases to watch in person. It's one of the toughest places to play. Without fans there, it's still a tough place to play because I think teams play more comfortable. They play their best at home, whether the fans are there or not. This year, it proves that, especially when you're dealing with COVID-19, daily testing, on the road, I think the teams have said they're more isolated from even themselves. They have to stay in their own rooms and eat away from the team. And, it's just a unique situation and it's a different season. And I think teams are playing better at home because it's more comfortable. The routines are a little more the same. For the Gophers, I just think that as they continue to lose on the road, it becomes, part of their identity and their personality, and they can't figure it out. I think more so than not, it's about their best player, and it's Marcus Carr. And for some reason, even last season, he just does not play well on the road. And, you need your best player, one of the best players in the Big Ten and point guards in the country, to play well, on the road for them to win.
Yeah, it's a good point. Carr obviously drives a lot of what they do. And it did seem like in that Purdue game, I mean, they got off to a really hot start. They're making 3-pointers left and right. It does feel like when things go sideways for them, whether it's at home or on the road, it's when they, any team is going to have this problem, but they stop making shots and they can't get baskets any other way. Are they, given that, are they, as you've watched them, are there things they could be doing differently? Is their approach the right one? Should they be shooting so many threes? I think it feels like it's a good strategy with the way that the modern game is, but if they're not making them, do they need to figure something else out in order to, sustain their offense and get baskets when they need it?
Yeah, yesterday I wrote about the 4 things that I saw in the first half of the Big Ten season that caused a lot of these road losses. And one of the big things you mentioned was the fact that they're shooting too many 3-pointers. Right now they're on pace to have the most 3-pointers attempted in school history, with the lowest 3-point percentage in school history. And so,
Okay.
there's something wrong about that stat, or those 2 stats, but I think what you see is a team that beat Iowa. They hit 17 3-pointers. Brandon Johnson hit 6 threes in that game. I'm sorry, 8 threes in that game. And he's only hit 1 3-pointer since then. I think it's a little of, you have the confidence that you can shoot it, whether you're not making it. But the teams are realizing that because of such a poor percentage from 3, they're giving them that shot. And, Liam Robbins, their 7-foot center, he even said at the Purdue game that they're double teaming in the post, but they leave me open from 3. Usually you take what the defense gives you, but sometimes that's not the best option. And, when your 7-footer is shooting 7 3-pointers in a game, yes, he's a capable shooter, but you need him closer to the basket. This is a team that really does not have a true post presence outside of Robbins. So when he's away from the basket, they really struggle to score in the paint. They really struggle to make a presence in the paint. And that's where the Big Ten is probably the strongest conference in the country, with, the center position. Every night you see a big man that's going to have a huge presence inside. And then Purdue, Trevion Williams, he really dominated inside, and then they had a lot of players compliment him.
Yeah, you mentioned that. You mentioned too that, the team doesn't really pay attention to bracketology right now, and nor should they. It's a long way to go. They got to focus on winning games. That said, there was an amusing bracket. I can't remember whose it was that had them as the 7 seed and Duke as the 10 seed, matched up again. Just 6 weeks to go or something like that before they would anything like that would play out. That's more fodder for fans than anything else. A good question for you though at this point is what do you think this team's ceiling is? Is it a team, is the ceiling get in and hope to win a game, or is this a better team than that? Is this a team that you think if they figure certain things out could, at least, have hopes of getting to a Sweet 16 or something like that?
Well, I did see that bracket. I think it was by Andy Katz and March Madness. Yeah, and I think Duke has a lot of more work to do than the Gophers to get in the tournament right now.
How about that? Yeah, how about that?
It's crazy. Yeah, that's crazy to say, all these blue bloods struggling this year, like Kentucky and North Carolina and such. But if you look at the Big Ten, I think that, clearly early on, we could say that there's probably 10 teams. I think even at one point there was 11 teams that could have made, a case to make the NCAA tournament. Northwestern's fallen from that. Rutgers has struggled a little bit, but they've gotten back together. So I think, when you look at the Big Ten, and the pecking order, Michigan is clearly the best team. Iowa, and Illinois have a chance to possibly make the Final Four. So teams outside of that, I think they're lucky, and they would probably say it's a great season if they make the Sweet 16. I don't consider Minnesota in that breath just yet because they've dropped off with some of these road losses, So I think that if they, at their best, when they've beaten Iowa, when they've beaten Michigan, which I think are two Final Four caliber teams, they look like a Sweet 16 team, right? But then when they lose on the road, and then now versus an unranked opponent in Purdue, who is not in the NCAA tournament mix just yet, they're trying to get in there. Then they look like a team that, they'll be lucky if they make the tournament. If they're a bubble team, they need to start winning some road games just to even be in the mix in March for the tournament.
Last thing for you, you have a story in Thursday's paper and on StarTribune.com kind of on how COVID has disrupted this season. Obviously, that's no secret, but you have a lot of good detail in it. Maybe, from what you wrote and what you reported for that story, what kind of havoc has the pandemic played on this college basketball season?
Well, at first, I think, all teams are lucky to be playing. We talk about Richard Pitino's team, but his father, Rick Pitino, and Iona, they've been on pause, it seems like, for half their season. So I think, Richard Pitino was lucky that he has not had COVID issues that have caused his team to go on pause. But the Big Ten itself has had 4 teams now on pause, including Michigan, their best team recently. And that's affected the entire league. Minnesota lost a game versus Nebraska on the road right after they beat Michigan. It destroyed their momentum, and now they've lost 2 in a row. So my story is going to talk about, a lot of teams in the Big Ten and how COVID-19 pauses, whether it was within the team or an opponent, has caused some of these teams to struggle with momentum. And Rutgers is a team that also struggled with momentum. They lost 5 straight games, and during that there was a pause. And now they've kind of regrouped. So I think Minnesota is trying to do that here Thursday at Rutgers.
It sounded like the Nebraska case. I read some quotes from Fred Hoiberg, their head coach. It sounded like that was pretty. It just ran through the team, and it sounded like he had a particularly rough bout with it, and is on the mend now. But that was within all this, it's the human element of it too. It's
scary, Obviously, people know Fred Hoiberg here. And, last year when COVID-19 really came on the scene in the Big Ten, Nebraska was the last team Minnesota played at home. And then they it came up in the Big Ten tournament where we were scared to see, fans not going to games, and all of a sudden the tournament canceled. So, it's come here again with the Big Ten, and we're trying to get through this and have a normal season, but we'll have to see how these teams can deal with having a pause.
All right, Marcus Fuller, thank you so much for joining the Daily Delivery podcast today. Follow his work, Star Tribune, StarTribune.com, Twitter, all those places. And Marcus, we'll chat with you again soon, okay?
All right, appreciate it.
Thanks again to Marcus for joining me on the program today. All guests on the Daily Delivery podcast receive an open standing invitation to join me for Taco Tuesday whenever this pandemic is all finished up. Speaking of the pandemic, at the beginning of the show, you heard me talking about the Wild and how the season has been shut down. Funny story about how that relates to the podcast. Not really that funny at all, actually, because the podcast perhaps is the curse on the Minnesota Wild. So at the outset of starting this show, I reached out to a lot of different public relations folks, media relations folks in the Twin Cities. Said, hey, I'd love to be able to get some guests on the show, some players, some executives, some head coaches, things like that. Give a different voice to the listeners. I get tired of hearing my own voice. Maybe you guys are too. So I reached out to the Wild. They said, yeah, absolutely, we can get you somebody for that first week. We kind of go back and forth. Who should it be? About 4 or 5 days ago, we settle on Marcus Foligno. Great, good guy, good talker, nice, solid first guest, off to a nice start this season. Probably no more than 24 hours after we settle on Marcus Foligno to be the interview. It was always going to be an interview that was going to happen yesterday, Wednesday. Marcus Foligno goes on the COVID list. Okay, this is, like I said, sports in 2020, 2021. This happens. So, we say, okay, let's pivot to a plan B. How about a couple other guys I'd put on my list? How about Jared Spurgeon, new captain this year? Perfect. So watching the game the other night, Jared Spurgeon, gets hurt, upper body injury, dreaded upper body injury. So, okay, now we're pivoting to a third potential person. Joel Eriksson Ek is next up on the list. Leading goal scorer for the Wild this season, having a surprisingly outburst with the scoring this year. Talked to him yesterday at 12:30 p.m. and no more than 4 hours later, we find out that he and Spurgeon and Foligno are all on the COVID protocol list. So I feel, jokingly, I feel responsible. Obviously, I'm not responsible, but this is not a great start to the attempt to get guests. But I do feel like some of what I talked to Eriksson Ek about is still relevant. I want to play you just a few minutes of that because, the season will resume at some point, and what he had to say was still interesting in that regard. So let's take a listen to a little bit of what I talked to Joel Eriksson Ek about. Right off the bat, I want to say I was any good host, any good interviewer does his homework. So I'm looking through Hockey Reference. That's my hockey site of choice. Looking at the Wild page, going through there. We're talking a lot about, Kirill Kaprizov, Kevin Fiala, that. Everybody knows Zach Parise. But Joel, I could not help but notice leading the team with 5 goals is a guy named Joel Eriksson Ek. What is going on this year?
Yeah, I think I had some lucky bounces as well as playing good, and I think just trying to work hard every day. Me and Greener have been spending most of the season together, and I think that's helped. Just learning how the other guy is thinking, just trying to speak a lot, and we know what to do to be successful. We're just trying to work hard and go to those hard-nosed areas and try to score.
Coming into this season, 24 goals for you in your first 210 career games, and some of that I'm sure is just getting to know the league. Aside from, bounces being what they may, or getting to know your line mates, do you feel like the progression of your game in this league has taken another step?
Yeah, I think I'm learning every day. Just watching a lot of hockey, just see what the best players are doing, just trying to learn from them and see what they are doing and what I can use in my game. And yeah, like I said, it's different coming from Sweden to over here. It's a lot of more games. The ice is a lot smaller too. So of course it was I had to learn, and I had to figure out how to play. And I think it feels better for every game that goes on.
Last thing for you, and then I'll let you go. What speaking of, I want to talk about hockey movies for just a minute. What is the best hockey movie in your estimation? And as a follow-up to that, why is it Slapshot?
Yeah, I think it's got to be Slapshot. I mean,
yes, good.
It's just fun. I mean, those guys are fun to watch, and I mean, I think every kid that watched that movie and playing hockey just thinks it's hilarious.
You are number one in my book for saying Slapshot is the best hockey movie. I appreciate it. Joel Eriksson Ek, thank you for joining me here on the Daily Delivery podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm really excited for Infrequently Asked Questions today, a segment where I ask listeners to send in something that's been on their mind, but maybe we don't talk about a whole lot in the sports world. Maybe it's something from the past. Maybe it's something that you just don't really think about. Here is today's question, which I got a listener to read for me.
Hello, Michael. This is your old friend Mac Wilson, a.k.a. Cenatite from the internet. My question is regarding our favorite cornerback from the Minnesota Vikings, Wasswa Serwanga. My question is, was Wasswa Serwanga really that bad? Or was the criticism from the Vikings community towards him sort of a veiled proxy for racism based on his Ugandan name? That's my question.
That is a lot to unpack, Mac. And it sent me down a rabbit hole, though, and we're not going to obviously solve any bigger picture questions of systemic racism in a 3 or 4 minute podcast segment. But I do think the rabbit hole that it sent me down about the 2000 Vikings season, which is the one that he really, is in question, which was, by the way, the NFC title game, that was 20 years ago. It's very upsetting, a little over 20 years ago. like 20 years in a couple weeks. It sent me down a rabbit hole about that team, and I think that helps explain a little bit about maybe why Wasswa has been somewhat unfairly maligned. So here we go on the 2000 Vikings, and we'll circle back and ultimately answer this question the best we can. But let's start here. By the time they got to the NFC title game, the season had kind of already fallen apart. And I know that sounds weird because they were favored in that game against the Giants. They were road favorites. But here's the thing. The team started 7-0, lost 2 in a row, then made it to 11-2. Then they lost their last 3 regular season games, all of them convincingly. They were down by at least double digits in the fourth quarter in all those games, including 31-10 to Indianapolis in the finale with a bye. A bye on the line, which they eventually got only because Martin Gramatica missed a 40-yard field goal at the end of regulation that would have given Tampa Bay a win over Green Bay and the NFC North title and the number 2 seed. Instead, Ryan Longwell wins it in overtime. The Vikings win the division and get a bye and get a very average Saints team in the division round. So Vikings play well in that game, but it's a little bit of fool's gold. They are back at home. They're rested, and yes, Wasswa Serwanga played well in that game. He was credited with 3 pass breakups, 6 tackles. He played well enough that the Star Tribune commissioned me, a very much younger writer at the time, to write a feature on him in the lead up to the Giants game. And I wrote the sentence that is seared into my brain: a burned corner has turned the corner. Against the Saints after some rough games that he'd been thrust into action late in the season, got torched by Marvin Harrison and the Colts. But I was asserting that based on this one game of evidence, this extremely small sample size, that he had turned the corner. Anyway, in that story, he says, corner is a position where they love you one minute and hate you the next. I was fortunate enough to come here and get the opportunity. More on that in a minute, of course. Let's check back on the reason he was even on the field in the first place. And obviously he was good enough to pass some people on the depth chart, get onto an NFL roster, which makes him a good player in and of itself. But it was a depth chart that had been wrecked by injuries. Remember Chris Dishman? He was their big offseason acquisition at corner that year. He played just 11 games, injured his shoulder, missed the stretch run and the playoffs. Kenny Wright, who appeared in all 16 regular season games with 7 starts, sprained his knee in the win over the Saints and did not play against the Giants. Starting safety Orlando Thomas was injured for part of the regular season, returned for the finale and the win over the Saints, strained his hamstring in the New Orleans win, and did not play against the Giants. The starting cornerbacks in the NFC title game against the Giants were Robert Tate, a converted wide receiver, and Serwanga. Defense actually keeps the Vikings in the game early. You might forget Robert Tate and Morgan each had an interception after the Giants were gifted an early lead. But the Vikings were completely inept all around. The final score lives in infamy, but did you realize it was 41-0 with 12:13 left in the third quarter? The third quarter, people. Anyway, out of the rabbit hole, back to the question. I think Serwanga became a convenient scapegoat for a team that was already falling apart. Maybe his distinct name plays a role in how he's remembered. I'd like to think race or nationality has nothing to do with how most Vikings fans at least think of him. Then again, I'd like to think the Vikings will win a Super Bowl sometime during my lifetime. All right, let's quickly finish with the cooler. The Twins sign Alex Colomé, relief pitcher. 47 saves a few years ago. Very good last year in the shortened season. ERA under 1. Good bullpen help. They can use it. The bigger picture thing I want to mention really quick, though, is I was guilty of this. You guys are all guilty of this. We grumble about the Twins not making any moves early in the offseason. Let's just wait it out next year. This is kind of how baseball rolls. This is how the Twins roll. They're not going to jump in and sign someone for too much money right away, at least not usually. This year, they've added J. Happ, Andrelton Simmons, re-signed Nelson Cruz, and now added Colomé, all of it basically in the last 2 weeks. So everybody help me remember, next year, let's not panic. That'll do it for today. Remember, subscribe to this podcast, subscribe to the Star Tribune, read StarTribune.com, read it for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Nothing but sports 24/7 in the Star Tribune. Thanks so much for joining me here on the Thursday edition of the Daily Delivery Podcast. We will see you again Friday. Huge show tomorrow. Brad Childress, former Vikings coach, Drew McGarry from Defector Media. Good stuff leading up to the Super Bowl.